The Minns government's contentious reforms in the wake of the Bondi massacre have made it through the New South Wales Parliament after a marathon debate stretching into the early hours of this Christmas Eve. The bill to tighten gun laws and which gives police extraordinary powers to restrict protests passed the upper house just before 3 a.m.
The legislation now goes back to the lower house to be rubber-stamped later this morning. Max Tillman is at New South Wales State Parliament this morning. Max, talk us through last night's sitting.
Yes, well, this very contentious bill, the Terrorism and Other Legislation Amendment Bill, which is also being described by some of its critics as an omnibus bill, passed the upper house of New South Wales last night 18-8, but it wasn't without contention. We particularly saw stiff resistance from not only the New South Wales Greens but also the Nationals and the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party. Now, one of the big criticisms of this bill, which is effectively a three-pillared piece of legislation that would address some of those very contentious protest restrictions here in New South Wales, what would end up being the strictest gun laws in all of Australia, and of course the criminalising or outlawing of terrorist symbols, the display of terrorist symbols like ISIS flags, had been criticised for effectively being bundled together and forced through both houses of Parliament. We'd heard earlier in the week from the Liberal leader, Kelly Sloan, in particular, that she said she'd only really been given the first glimpse of this particular bill last Saturday, and that was really one of the main criticisms that we heard last night in the upper house of New South Wales. In fact, there were more than 180 amendments that were put before the upper house. One of those that was ultimately unsuccessful was effectively splitting this omnibus bill into three separate bills. So each of those could be analysed and debated independently of one another. Now, what we saw last night following that 18-8 vote was effectively a clear path for this bill to become legislation. One thing that we definitely saw last night was the Greens getting one of the few amendments through to get unanimous support across both houses. That particular amendment would make it more difficult for someone to obtain a firearm licence in New South Wales if they have suspected links to a terrorist organisation. It would also effectively make it more difficult for someone to obtain a firearm licence if they live in the same home as someone with suspected terror links. We also saw a number of other amendments that were particularly put forward by the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party. One of their big concerns, particularly when it comes to those gun reforms, was that regular, legal, law-abiding licence holders were being effectively targeted over something that, according to the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party, had absolutely nothing to do with those legal firearm holders. One of those new laws that will now pass through the lower house later today and effectively be rubber-stamped would restrict the maximum number of firearms that a licence holder could own to 4, with an exception made for farmers extending that to 10. We also saw the Greens last night once again vocalise their concerns over these anti-protest laws that would essentially allow the New South Wales Police Commissioner to cancel any Form 1 applications. That's essentially a protest permit here in New South Wales while the state is under a terror designation, and that could effectively be extended for up to 3 months and since that terror designation was formalised by the New South Wales Police Commissioner. And that was a major concern for the Greens, and in fact yesterday we saw the Greens joining a number of other activist groups in joining a constitutional challenge against those laws, and we do expect those court documents to be filed in the Supreme Court here in New South Wales in January. But now that that omnibus bill has passed both houses successfully, it will now return to the lower house later today to be rubber stamped.